The weight of the rifle felt heavier than it should have been, though not because of the steel or the wood. It was the memory bound into it, the years of calloused hands that had cleaned it, carried it, trusted it, and finally passed it on. The M24 had been her father's constant companion, not just a weapon but a legacy, a piece of discipline forged in war, and when she cradled it now, its cold barrel pressing against her forearm, she felt the silent presence of him watching. Her father had not been a man of many words, but he was a Navy SEAL through and through. His lessons hadn't come in long speeches but in repetitions, drills, small corrections, hours under the punishing sun, and nights when silence was instruction enough. She had grown up in the shadow of those lessons, her childhood colored by the steady hum of preparation, her playgrounds the ranges and obstacle courses he built in the backyard, her lullabies the soft clicks of rifle bolts sliding home. Now years later that training, once just a strange, demanding game between father and daughter, was the only reason 100 souls still had a chance to live. The town was small, forgotten by the outside world, the kind of place where time seemed to stagnate between dust and decay. It had been weeks since the threat rose out of the horizon like a storm, weeks since the gangs had started sweeping across the countryside, burning, taking, killing. They were organized in their chaos, fueled by greed and cruelty, and when word reached the town that they were coming, panic set in like fire. Families huddled together, mothers clutching infants, men pacing with little more than farm tools in their hands, and children crying without understanding why the adults looked so pale. She had been away then, working in another county, but the call from her uncle changed everything. "They'll be here by nightfall," he'd said, voice low and breaking. "We don't have anyone who can fight them." She didn't hesitate. She packed light, slung the rifle case across her shoulder, and drove back to the place she once thought she'd escaped forever. When she arrived, the fear was almost tangible, clinging to the walls of houses, echoing in whispers from door to door. They gathered in the old school building, the only structure large enough to hold everyone. It smelled of chalk and dust and desperation. 100 lives, give or take, huddled together under the flickering light of a few hanging bulbs. She counted them instinctively, her mind cataloging their faces the way her father had taught her to map terrain. Every detail mattered, every variable counted. Old Mr. Rayburn sat hunched over with his oxygen tank. The Martinez twins clutched each other so tightly it seemed they shared one heartbeat. A young mother tried to quiet her baby with a bottle of water and sugar, their food long gone. These were the people she was about to stand for, the weight of their existence pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't their leader. She wasn't even sure she was ready for this. But she had the rifle, the training, and her father's voice echoing in the back of her skull. "You don't wait for someone else to do the right thing." She pulled the rifle free from its case, the metal glinting faintly beneath the weak light. Conversations died around her. She could feel their eyes on her, uncertain, hopeful, afraid. "My father taught me to use this," she said quietly, though her voice carried in the stillness. "He taught me more than just how to shoot. He taught me how to fight, how to protect. If they come, we won't just sit and wait to be taken." The silence deepened, but she saw sparks ignite in their gazes, fragile flames of belief. Her uncle stepped forward, his weathered face lined with both worry and pride. "Then we'll follow you," he said. She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him she wasn't ready, that she wasn't a soldier, but the words never left her throat. They needed her to be strong, and in that moment she realized that her father's lessons hadn't been just for her. They had been for this very day. The first night was a blur of preparation. She led them out into the darkness, showing them how to barricade, how to set traps, how to listen for the smallest sound that didn't belong. Most had never held a gun before, but under her instruction they learned quickly, desperation sharpening their focus. She taught them how to move, how to duck and cover, how to load and fire. The men who had laughed at her years ago, dismissing her drills as pointless, now stood at attention as if she were the only anchor keeping them from drowning. The women who had once pitted her for having a father so harsh now mimicked her grip on the rifle, steadying their breathing the way she showed them. Even the children absorbed the urgency, carrying messages, fetching water, watching with wide eyes as she mapped out defensive lines on the dusty floor with chalk. For the first time since the threat had risen, the town moved with purpose, not panic. When dawn came they were exhausted, but the air carried a strange kind of energy. She climbed to the roof of the school, the M24 slung across her chest, and surveyed the horizon. The world stretched out in muted colors, the early light painting the fields in pale gold. In the distance, the faintest haze of smoke curled upward, a reminder that destruction wasn't far away. She adjusted the scope, her eyes narrowing. Every hill, every tree, every shadow became part of her mental map. She knew they'd come. It was only a matter of when. As she lay there, the stock pressed against her shoulder, she whispered to the rifle as her father once had. "You've still got work to do." "So do I." By mid-afternoon she had the townsfolk rotating shifts. Some stood guard, others rested, and a few prepared what little supplies they had left. She kept herself moving, checking every post, correcting mistakes, offering encouragement where fear threatened to creep back in. A group of teenagers lingered near her, watching as she disassembled and reassembled the M24 with fluid precision. "How do you stay calm?" one of them asked, voice trembling. She looked at him, remembering her father's gaze when she'd asked the same question at 14. "You don't," she said honestly. "You just keep moving, keep breathing, and don't let fear make your choices." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, and she saw resolve flicker in his eyes. Night fell again, and with it came the sound. Engines, distant but growing louder, headlights cutting through the dark like hungry eyes. The people inside the school stirred, whispers spreading like fire. She stood at the doorway, rifle in hand, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of lanterns. "They're here," she said simply. Panic threatened to break free, but she raised her hand, steady and commanding. "Stay in position. Remember what we practiced. Trust each other." She walked out into the night, climbing once more to the rooftop, her body steady though her heart pounded like thunder. She lay flat, breath slow, scope aligned. Through the glass she saw them. Trucks, bikes, men armed with rifles and machetes, faces twisted with the promise of violence. 100 souls behind her depended on one choice, one shot, one stand. She pressed her cheek against the stock, finger brushing the trigger, and thought of her father. This was the moment everything had been leading to. She exhaled, steady and calm, and the world narrowed to the crosshairs. The first shot cracked through the night like lightning splitting the sky, a sharp report that silenced the engines for a heartbeat. Her bullet found its mark, dropping the lead rider from his bike, his body tumbling across the dirt road. The gang roared in anger, headlights jerking as vehicles swerved, and suddenly the quiet outskirts of the town became a battlefield. She didn't wait to see their reaction. Bolt back, cartridge out, next round in, her hands moved with instinctive precision. The M24 wasn't just a rifle, it was an extension of her body, an echo of her father's steady patience. Another shot, another man dropped, and chaos rippled through the approaching horde. They weren't expecting resistance, certainly not this kind. For too long they had preyed on unprepared villages, their reign fueled by fear. But here, tonight they met something else. Below her, the townsfolk held their breath. Mothers clutched children, fathers gripped the makeshift weapons she had taught them to use. Every shot she fired bought them courage, every falling enemy a reminder that they weren't helpless anymore. The gang tried to push forward, yelling and firing blindly into the dark, but she shifted positions, never lingering, always calculating. The scope became her world, each face illuminated in fleeting clarity before she chose which life to end. Her father's lessons pulsed through her veins. Never waste a bullet, never reveal a pattern, and above all, protect the ones behind you. The gang retaliated, bullets tearing into rooftops and walls, sparks flying as metal struck stone. She rolled aside, dirt biting into her elbows, but her focus never wavered. From her vantage point, she guided the defense, signaling with quick gestures to those below. The men and women she had trained now answered with return fire, clumsy but determined, their shots forcing the attackers to spread out. The traps they'd set earlier sprang to life, spikes shredding tires, wire snapping ankles, and Molotovs lighting up the road with fire. Screams echoed, curses carried on the wind, but still they pressed forward, driven by greed and rage. She adjusted her scope to the truck at the rear, the one carrying crates of ammunition. A single, perfect breath, and the shot punched through the driver's window, jerking the vehicle off the road and straight into a ditch. The explosion when it hit the ground shook the night, a fireball that threw shadows across the school's walls. Cheers erupted from inside, desperate voices clinging to hope. But she didn't cheer. She knew this was only the beginning. They would come harder now, angrier, and if they broke through, 100 souls would be lost. Her uncle climbed to the rooftop, crawling low beside her. His face was streaked with sweat and ash, but his eyes burned with something close to pride. "You're holding them," he said, almost in disbelief. She didn't look at him, her cheek still pressed against the rifle. "For now," she muttered. The truth weighed heavy on her. Ammunition was limited, and every shot had to count. She had a pouch of rounds, maybe 50 left. 50 chances to tip the scale, 50 breaths between life and death. Her father's voice whispered again, calm and steady in the back of her mind, It's not about how many you take down. It's about protecting what matters. The night stretched into a blur of muzzle flashes and screams. She lost track of how many she dropped, each one collapsing into the dust like a domino in a line of violence. Her body moved mechanically, loading, firing, shifting. Her shoulder ached, her eyes burned from staring through the scope, but she refused to stop. Somewhere behind her, a child cried, muffled quickly by a mother's trembling hand, and the sound hardened her resolve. No one was going to touch them. Not while she still had strength to pull the trigger. As the hours dragged on, the attackers fell back, regrouping just beyond the reach of firelight. The silence was thick, almost worse than the gunfire, broken only by the groans of their wounded. She lay still, her body tense, listening. She knew what came next. They would try again, smarter, more ruthless. She turned her head slightly, catching her uncle's exhausted gaze. "Get everyone ready," she whispered. This was just the first wave. He hesitated, then nodded and crawled back down. Alone again, she lay against the rooftop, rifle nestled against her chest, eyes scanning the horizon. The stars above felt cold and distant, indifferent to the struggle below. She thought of her father again, the last time she saw him, the way he had pressed the rifle case into her hands before his final deployment. One day, he had said, "You'll understand why I gave you this." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. Now she understood. It wasn't about the weapon. It was about the promise it carried, the promise to protect, to stand firm when others could not. The second assault came near dawn. They stormed in from two sides, engines roaring, men screaming, bullets slicing the air. She snapped into motion, dropping the lead gunner on a truck, then swinging to the right flank to cut down another. The townsfolk answered with gunfire and shouted warnings, their fear tempered by the hours they'd survived. Traps exploded, walls shook, but the defense held. She moved like a ghost across the rooftops, the rifle barking thunder into the morning light, her body fueled by exhaustion and adrenaline. She wasn't just her father's daughter anymore. She was the shield between life and annihilation. One of the attackers broke through, slipping past the outer barricade. She spotted him sprinting toward the school, rifle raised, and time seemed to slow. She shifted, crosshairs tracking his movement, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang true, sending him sprawling before he reached the door. A collective gasp of relief swept through the building, but she didn't let herself celebrate. Another man came, then another, and each one fell to her scope, until the dirt was littered with bodies and the survivors of the gang began to falter. Finally, as the sun rose higher, the remaining attackers retreated, dragging their wounded, their engines sputtering as they disappeared into the horizon. The battlefield was silent once more, broken only by the crackle of smoldering fires. She lowered the rifle, her hands trembling, her breath ragged. Around her, the townsfolk began to emerge, faces pale but alive, eyes filled with awe. Children pointed at her, whispering like she was some myth come to life. Men clasped each other's shoulders, women cried openly, and slowly voices began to rise in gratitude. But she didn't bask in their thanks. She knew this wasn't over. They would come back, maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they would not forgive the humiliation of being beaten by a forgotten town led by a girl with her father's rifle. As she cleaned the weapon, wiping soot and sweat from its barrel, she made a silent vow. If they returned, she would be ready. For the 100 souls who looked at her now with faith, for the memory of her father who had shaped her, and for the promise she had carried all these years, she would not let them fall. The morning after the battle carried a strange stillness, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The townsfolk moved like shadows, cleaning debris, tending to the wounded, patching bullet holes in the walls with trembling hands. She walked among them, the M24 slung across her back, eyes scanning the horizon even while her body ached with exhaustion. Every step reminded her of how little sleep she'd had, but she forced herself onward. Her father had drilled it into her since she was a child. Fatigue was an enemy, but one you could outlast with discipline. She pushed the pain down and let her focus sharpen. Her people, because that's what they had become now, needed her steady, not broken. Inside the school, she moved through the crowded rooms, checking on the children first. They looked at her with wide eyes, some still trembling, others whispering her name as though it were a prayer. A little girl tugged on her sleeve and held up a crayon drawing, stick figures behind a tall figure holding a long rifle. The drawing was crude, shaky, but it pierced her chest like a bullet. She crouched down, brushing the girl's hair gently, forcing a small smile. "You're safe," she whispered, though the words carried more weight in her own heart than the child's. Safe for now, she thought, but how long until the next storm came crashing? Her uncle approached, his boots echoing on the cracked tiles. They won't stay gone, he said, voice low but firm. He had always been a realist, never one for illusions. She nodded without hesitation. I know. They'll regroup. They'll want revenge. The weight of that truth settled heavily between them. Then we don't wait, he continued. We prepare. We make this town a fortress. His eyes searched hers as if waiting for her to disagree, but she didn't. Instead, she placed a hand on the M24 and said, if they want a fight, they'll get one. But we'll be ready next time. The days that followed became a blur of preparation. She drilled the townsfolk relentlessly, turning farmers into sentries, teachers into tacticians, children into watchful messengers. She showed them how to move silently through the alleys, how to spot tracks in the dirt, how to listen for the faintest out-of-place sound. At night, she set them on rotations, ensuring the town was never blind, never vulnerable. Her uncle organized supplies, rationing what little food remained. Others scavenged for weapons, anything they could repurpose. It wasn't enough, not really, but desperation made every scrap valuable. She knew it still wasn't enough to withstand a full assault, but with every passing day they grew sharper, stronger, more disciplined. Despite the progress, doubt gnawed at her. She lay awake on the roof most nights, staring through the scope into endless darkness, her body tense at every rustle of wind. She thought of her father constantly, his voice threading through her mind like a lifeline. He had been through battles she could only imagine, and he had survived them because he never underestimated his enemy. That's what terrified her the most. She didn't know what the gang would bring next. Trucks, weapons, sheer numbers, they had all of it. She had a single rifle, a few boxes of ammunition, and 100 fragile lives depending on her. One night, as the town slept fitfully below, her uncle joined her on the rooftop. He brought 2 mugs of bitter coffee, the only luxury left. They sat in silence for a long time, the sky stretched wide and merciless above them. Finally he spoke. Your father would be proud, he said, his voice rough. The words twisted something inside her. Pride wasn't enough. Pride couldn't stop bullets. He'd tell me to do more, she replied. He'd say I wasn't ready yet. That I'm not enough. Her uncle turned to her, eyes steady. Maybe he would. But you're here. And they're alive because of you. She swallowed hard, staring into the distance where smoke still lingered faintly from the last battle. Alive for now, she thought, but how many more times could they endure? 3 nights later the answer came. She spotted movement on the horizon through her scope. A column of trucks, bigger than before, more headlights cutting through the dark. Her stomach tightened, her breath shallow. They were back, and this time they had come prepared. She rang the warning bell, the iron clanging through the night, rousing the townsfolk from uneasy dreams. Panic stirred at first, but her voice cut through the fear. Positions. Just like we practiced. Move. The drills she'd run paid off. The people scrambled into place with surprising speed, barricades reinforced, weapons loaded, eyes wide but determined. The fear was still there, yes, but it was tempered with something else. Trust. They trusted her. She climbed back to her post, the M24 snug against her shoulder, her cheek pressed to the worn stock that still carried faint traces of her father's hand oil. Through the scope she counted the vehicles, 6 trucks, maybe more, hidden in the dark. Dozens of men, heavily armed, faces hardened with rage. This was no raid. This was a war party, intent on crushing the defiance that had humiliated them before. She whispered under her breath, a ritual now. Steady, Dad. Watch with me. The first truck crossed the line she'd etched in her mind, and she fired. The shot cracked across the valley, and the lead driver's skull erupted in crimson. Chaos followed, but it was disciplined chaos, practiced men diving into cover, spreading out with deadly precision. She realized then that this fight would be unlike the first. These weren't just raiders anymore. These were killers coming to finish what they started. Gunfire exploded from both sides, the night alive with muzzle flashes. Her townsfolk fought back with everything she had taught them, their bullets answering the storm. She shifted targets constantly, taking out leaders, gunners, the ones who shouted orders. Every time one fell, the gang faltered, if only for a moment, and in those moments the town breathed. Still they pressed closer. Molotovs lit the road again, barricades burst into flames, screams tore through the night. She moved like a machine, her body numb to the ache, each shot precise, deadly. Her father's voice echoed with every pull of the trigger, protect what matters. And then she saw him, their leader, tall and broad, scars cutting across his face, barking commands from the back of a truck. Rage burned in his eyes, but so did calculation. He wasn't reckless like the others. He was watching, studying, and she realized with a chill that he was studying her. Through the scope, their eyes met for a heartbeat, predator to predator. She pulled the trigger but he ducked just in time, the bullet sparking off metal instead of flesh. He grinned, teeth bared, and pointed directly at her position. A hail of bullets rained down on the rooftop, forcing her to roll for cover. Dust and splinters filled her mouth, but she gritted her teeth and slid back into position. This was no longer just survival. This was personal. The battle raged until dawn, a storm of fire and blood. By the time the sun edged over the horizon, the town was scarred, walls blackened, bodies littering the dirt. Yet the people were still standing, bruised but unbroken. The gang retreated once more, dragging their dead and wounded, their leader still alive but bleeding from a graze across his cheek, a mark she had given him. He had looked back one last time before disappearing into the smoke, his expression promising that this wasn't the end. She lowered the rifle slowly, her body trembling, her breath ragged. Around her, the people began to emerge, their eyes wide with exhaustion and awe. She had bought them another sunrise, another chance at life. But deep down she knew the fight was far from over. The war had only begun. The dawn after the second assault was painted in blood and smoke, and yet the town still stood. She walked through the wreckage with her rifle in hand, boots crunching over shattered glass and bullet casings. The air reeked of burnt fuel and charred wood, the acrid stench clinging to her throat. Survivors moved like ghosts, carrying buckets of water, tending to the wounded, covering the dead with tattered sheets. Each face she passed looked at her with something between gratitude and fear, as if she had become more myth than flesh. She didn't let them see the tremor in her hands, the way her chest ached with every breath. She was their shield, their hunter, and shields didn't break, not in front of those who needed them. The children were the hardest to face. They followed her with wide eyes, clinging to their mother's skirts, whispering stories about how she could see in the dark, how her rifle never missed, how even the devil himself would fear her aim. She wanted to tell them the truth, that she was just a woman with too few bullets and too much responsibility, but she swallowed the words. If they needed to believe in a legend to feel safe, then she would wear that mask. Her father had once told her that leadership wasn't about strength alone, but about carrying the weight of others' faith without letting it crush you. She felt that weight now, pressing down heavier than the M24 on her shoulder. Her uncle found her near the edge of town, surveying the fields where bodies lay sprawled like discarded dolls. He placed a hand on her arm, his grip firm. "They'll come back," he said, voice flat with certainty. She nodded, eyes narrowing on the horizon. "And when they do, they won't stop until every last one of us is gone." His silence confirmed he believed the same. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady the storm inside her. "We can't wait for them to choose the time. We need to be ready before they are." He looked at her for a long moment, then finally asked, "What are you planning?" She tightened her grip on the rifle and said, "I'm going to make sure they never think of this town as prey again." The following days became a crucible. She drove the townsfolk harder than before, teaching them not just to defend but to think like predators. She led scouting parties beyond the perimeter, showing them how to move silently through brush, how to track tire marks and footprints, how to listen for the unnatural rhythm of men moving where they shouldn't. She taught them ambush tactics, how to set kill zones, how to vanish into cover before their enemies knew what struck them. They were clumsy at first, but desperation sharpened their edges quickly. Even the elders contributed, weaving nets, building traps, repurposing farm tools into brutal weapons. The town began to change from a fragile shell into something harder, more dangerous. Yet with each passing night, the weight of leadership carved deeper into her. Sleep became rare, her dreams fractured by echoes of gunfire and her father's voice. She saw his face often, lined and stern, the way he looked when he trained her, when he pushed her past tears into grit. Sometimes she thought she heard him whisper approval in the wind, other times she feared she was chasing a ghost she could never live up to. But when doubt gnawed at her, she remembered the faces in the schoolhouse, the mother with her baby, the children with their drawings, the old man gasping through his oxygen mask, and the doubt turned into steel. She wasn't allowed to break. Not while they still breathed. It was near midnight when a scout returned, breathless and pale. "They're gathering," he stammered. "South Road. More trucks. More guns. At least 100 men." The word struck like a hammer. She dismissed him gently, then climbed to the roof with her M24, staring out into the dark as if she could pierce the miles with her eyes alone. 100 men. Twice the size of the last force, maybe more. They weren't coming for loot this time. They were coming for revenge. She lay flat, pressing her cheek against the stock, the cool steel grounding her as she whispered, "Dad, I need you with me." The silence answered, but in that silence she felt the echo of his lessons. Trust your training. Trust your instincts. Protect what matters. The next day she gathered the entire town in the schoolhouse. The air was thick with fear but also with a fierce kind of loyalty. She stood before them, the M24 slung across her chest, her voice steady despite the storm inside. They're coming again, she said, no softness in her tone. Murmurs spread, eyes widened, but she raised a hand and silence fell. They'll bring more men, more guns, and they'll think they can crush us. But we are not prey anymore. We are ready and we will fight. Her words echoed in the dusty hall, and for a moment she saw herself through their eyes. Not just a woman, not just a daughter with her father's rifle, but a leader forged in fire. The people straightened, their fear still there but no longer paralyzing. She had given them something stronger to hold on to, hope. As the sun dipped low, preparations turned frantic. Barricades reinforced with steel beams, hidden trenches dug across the road, glass bottles filled with gasoline lined up like soldiers. She inspected every post, adjusted every rifle, encouraged every trembling hand. The townsfolk followed her without question now, their trust absolute. When night fell, she climbed once more to her perch on the rooftop, the rifle gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She checked the chamber, whispered a prayer, and pressed her eye to the scope. Far out on the horizon, faint headlights appeared, small sparks in the endless dark. They were coming. The final storm was about to break. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the approaching engines, but her breathing stayed steady. She thought of her father again, of the way he had once placed his hand on her shoulder after her first clean shot. You've got the eye, he'd said. But more important, you've got the will. That's what wins battles. She clung to those words now as the trucks drew closer, their roar rising like thunder. 100 souls slept behind her, depending on her will to hold. She settled into position, finger brushing the trigger, crosshairs steady. The enemy poured into view, engines snarling, men shouting, weapons gleaming in the dim light. She exhaled slowly, her world narrowing to the circle of glass before her. This was it. The fight that would decide whether her people lived or died. She pressed her cheek harder into the stock, whispered, "With me, Dad," and squeezed the trigger as the night exploded in fire. The first shot tore through the windshield of the lead truck, sending the vehicle swerving and colliding with the one behind it. Men tumbled out, shouting orders, gunfire erupting in staccato bursts that shattered the silence of night. She worked the bolt of her M24, chambering another round with practiced speed, exhaling steady as she lined up her next target. A man rose with a rocket launcher slung on his shoulder, her finger squeezed and his body dropped before he could fire. Her townsfolk opened up with their rifles from behind barricades, the night blazing with muzzle flashes, smoke rising like a curtain of war. For the first time they fought not as panicked civilians but as a unit, each one where she had drilled them to be. The enemy advanced with fury, their numbers overwhelming, but the traps she'd prepared tore into their momentum. Tires shredded on hidden spikes, trenches swallowed the weight of their trucks, Molotovs ignited fuel lines, transforming machines into burning wrecks. Still they came, leaping over flames and ducking behind twisted metal, bullets sparking against stone and steel. She moved methodically, every shot from the M24 finding flesh, leaders first, the ones barking orders. Each time one fell, confusion rippled through their ranks, buying precious seconds for her people. Her uncle's shotgun thundered from the barricades, each blast sending bodies crumpling to the dirt. Young men who had never held weapons weeks ago now fought like seasoned defenders, fear swallowed by survival. Women hurled flaming bottles, fire raining down on advancing figures. Even the elders held their ground, wielding axes, hammers, anything sharp enough to make a difference. They fought with the desperation of those who knew there was no escape, only victory or annihilation. She shifted position, crawling across the rooftop as bullets chewed the tiles around her. She could feel the heat of passing rounds, fragments of clay biting her skin, but she stayed low, heart pounding like a drum. Through the scope she caught sight of him again. The leader with the scar, moving through the chaos like a general, shouting commands, rallying his men. His presence held them together, kept them pressing forward despite their losses. Her hands tightened around the rifle. Take him out and the beast loses its head. She centered the crosshairs on his chest, slowed her breath and squeezed. But at the last second, a man stumbled into her line of fire, the bullet punching through him instead. She cursed under her breath, racked the bolt and searched again, but the leader had slipped into cover. The battle surged closer, the enemy pushing into the outskirts of the town. Screams echoed as barricades fell, fighters dragged into the dirt. She abandoned the rooftop, sliding down a ladder and hitting the ground running, the M24 clutched tight. She moved through smoke and shadows, her training carrying her like a phantom through the chaos. At a corner, she knelt, steadying the rifle across a broken wall, dropping another gunman before he could execute a wounded boy. She pulled the boy up, shoving him toward safety, then pressed forward again. Her uncle intercepted her, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "We're holding them, but not for long," he shouted over the gunfire. She nodded sharply. "Keep the center strong. I'll cut them off on the flank." Before he could protest, she was already sprinting through the smoke, weaving between shattered buildings. She ducked into an alley, emerged behind a burning truck, and spotted a cluster of men regrouping near the south road. They hadn't seen her yet. She dropped prone, sighted, and fired. One fell, then another, then a third before the rest scattered in panic. She shifted again, her movements fluid, her presence like a ghost threading through the battlefield. But the enemy wasn't breaking. For every one she felled, two more seemed to surge forward. Explosions rocked the night, the earth trembling beneath her. She could feel the exhaustion creeping in, her muscles screaming, her hands slick with sweat, but she refused to slow. She thought of the children in the schoolhouse, the mothers clutching their babies, the old man gasping through his oxygen mask. She thought of her father, of the promise she had made on his grave. Protect them. Always. And so she pressed harder, every bullet carrying his name, every breath a vow. Hours bled together in fire and blood. The town became a battlefield of smoke and shadows, every street a killing ground, every doorway a stronghold. Her people fought like lions, unyielding even as their numbers thinned. She moved among them, the eye of the storm, her rifle never still. When ammunition ran low, she scavenged from the fallen, switching to pistols, knives, whatever she could find. She became more than a sniper. She was a warrior, a daughter forged in her father's shadow, carrying his spirit with every strike. Then came the moment she feared. From the smoke, the scarred leader emerged, a pistol in one hand, a machete in the other, his eyes locked on her. Around him, his men shouted and pressed harder, emboldened by his presence. She raised the M24, but he fired first, the bullet slamming into the wall inches from her head. She dove for cover, heart hammering, dust choking her lungs. The battle around them seemed to fade, everything narrowing to the predator stalking her. He barked orders, his men keeping her pinned as he advanced. She rolled, darted into an alley, the M24 clutched tight, but the leader was relentless. His footsteps pounded behind her, closer with every second. She skidded around a corner, dropped to a knee and aimed. He appeared, machete raised, his grin twisted with rage. She fired. The bullet caught his shoulder, spinning him back with a snarl, but he didn't fall. He came on, blood soaking his shirt, eyes burning. She scrambled to her feet, the bolt jammed, the rifle suddenly nothing but dead weight. He lunged, swinging the machete, and she barely dodged, the blade slicing a shallow line across her arm. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but she shoved it aside, shoving him back with the butt of her rifle. They clashed in the dirt, predator against predator, his strength against her will. He swung with brute force, she countered with precision, every move born of training drilled into her bones. He drove her back, his rage a tidal wave, but she clung to her focus, to the memory of her father's voice. Never let the storm control you. Control the storm. With a surge of resolve, she twisted, yanked the machete from his hand, and drove her knee into his chest, knocking him sprawling. He roared, scrambling up, but she was faster. She leveled the M24, blood dripping from her arm, her breath ragged, her fingers steady. "This is for them," she hissed and pulled the trigger. The shot ripped through his chest, his body jerking before he crumpled to the dirt, his eyes wide in disbelief. For a heartbeat, silence fell across the battlefield. His men froze, their leader lying lifeless in the dust. Then, like a wave breaking, they faltered, their shouts turning to panic, their formation collapsing. Some fled into the smoke, others dropped their weapons and surrendered. The tide shifted in an instant. Her people surged forward, driving the broken remnants back, reclaiming the ground they had lost. She stood over the body, chest heaving, blood mixing with sweat, her hands trembling. Around her, the town erupted in a mixture of victory and grief, voices rising into the dawn as the last shots faded. She lowered the M24 slowly, the weight of it heavier than it had ever been, as though it carried not just steel and wood, but every soul it had saved. The battle was won, but as she looked at the broken streets, the fires still burning, and the faces of those who would never rise again, she knew the cost had been carved deep into all of them. Victory was theirs, But survival had come with scars that would never fade. The sun rose over the ruined town like a reluctant witness, spilling pale light across blackened ruins and blood-stained soil. The fires had burned low through the night, leaving behind smoldering husks of trucks, shattered barricades, and bodies scattered like discarded shadows. She stood on the rooftop where the battle had begun, the M24 heavy in her hands, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting another wave to appear. The silence after so much chaos felt unreal, like the world itself was holding its breath. Behind her, the town stirred with exhausted survivors, their voices hushed, their movements slow. They were alive, but the victory was bitter, each heartbeat bought with the blood of friends and family who would never rise again. She lowered herself onto the tiles, legs folding beneath her, the rifle laid across her lap. For the first time since the fighting began, she allowed her shoulders to sag, the weight of her body pressing into the roof. Her arm throbbed from the wound carved by the machete, bandaged hastily in the heat of battle. Every muscle screamed with fatigue, but sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scarred leader's face, twisted in rage as he lunged at her, the shock frozen in his eyes as the bullet took him. She had killed before in the firefight, but this was different. This was intimate, up close, the breath of her enemy hot on her cheek, his blood staining her skin. She told herself it had been necessary, she knew it was, but the weight of it still pressed into her chest. Below, the survivors worked in grim silence. Bodies were gathered, laid out in rows, covered with sheets where cloth could be spared. Children cried softly, clinging to their mothers, while men dug shallow graves in the hard earth with blistered hands. She watched as her uncle moved among them, his face carved with lines of grief but his posture steady, offering what little comfort he could. She should have been down there with them, sharing the burden, but her legs refused to carry her. She felt suspended, caught between the exhaustion of survival and the demand to lead again. For even in the aftermath, she knew the danger wasn't over. Raiders didn't stop because of one defeat. They regrouped, rebuilt, and returned. If this town was to endure, it needed more than a desperate defense. It needed a future. Her uncle climbed the ladder, boots scraping against the wood, and joined her on the rooftop. He sat beside her without a word for a long while, both of them staring at the horizon. Finally he spoke, his voice low and raw. "We lost 23 last night." The number struck like a hammer. She had known the cost would be high, but hearing it aloud made it real. 23 faces, each with a story, each one gone forever. She closed her eyes, breathing slow, steadying the storm inside. "And yet we still stand," she whispered. He nodded, his gaze hard. "Because of you." She shook her head, jaw tight. "Because of all of us. I just pulled a trigger. They're the ones who held the line." But he didn't argue. He knew as she did that without her none of them would have survived. That night, after the graves were filled and the fires finally extinguished, the town gathered in the schoolhouse once more. Lanterns flickered against the walls, shadows dancing across weary faces. The air was thick with grief but also with something else, resolve. She stood at the front, the M24 slung across her chest, bandage stark against her arm. She didn't want to speak, but they looked to her, their eyes demanding words. She drew in a deep breath, steadying herself. "We lost too many," she began, her voice rough but steady. "We stood against an enemy twice our size and we bled for it. But we did not break. And we will not break. This rifle was my father's. He taught me that it wasn't the weapon that mattered, but the will of the one holding it. Last night it wasn't just me. It was every one of you. Together we proved we are stronger than those who would take everything from us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She saw tears in some eyes, fire in others. A boy, no more than 15, raised his hand timidly. "Will they come back?" The question was raw, spoken in the voice of a child but carrying the weight of every soul in the room. She held his gaze, refusing to lie. "Yes," she said simply. "They will come back. But when they do, we'll be ready. We'll be stronger than before. Because now we know what we are capable of." The boy nodded slowly, and she saw a flicker of determination in his eyes, the same kind she felt burning inside her despite the exhaustion. Days turned into weeks and the town transformed. The survivors buried their dead, mourned their losses, and then rebuilt. Houses were patched with scavenged wood, barricades reinforced with steel and stone. She led patrols beyond the outskirts, striking at raiding parties before they could gather strength. She drilled her people daily, teaching them not only to fight but to endure, to adapt, to never let fear control them. The children grew quieter, their games mimicking soldiers instead of farmers, their laughter edged with something harder. War had changed them all, carved innocence out of their bones, but it had also given them something they had lacked before: unity. And yet, even as she worked tirelessly, she felt the shadows pressing closer. At night, she lay awake in the schoolhouse with her rifle by her side, staring at the ceiling as doubts gnawed at her. Could they survive another attack as large as the last? Could she keep carrying this weight alone? Her father's memory was both a shield and a chain, inspiring her but also reminding her of how far she still had to climb to live up to his name. Some nights she swore she could hear his voice, telling her she was enough, that she had already done more than he ever asked. But other nights, the silence screamed louder, telling her she would fail, that she would lose them all in the end. One evening, as she returned from a patrol, she found the townsfolk gathered in the square. Lanterns glowed, faces illuminated with something more than weariness. Her uncle stepped forward, holding a rough-hewn flag stitched from scraps of fabric. On it was a simple symbol, a rifle crossed with a sheaf of wheat. "We made this," he said, holding it out to her. "A banner for us, for what we're building. And we want you to carry it." She stared at the flag, throat tight. "Why me?" she whispered. An old woman stepped from the crowd, eyes glistening. "Because you gave us back our lives. Because you are the reason we're still here." She took the flag slowly, her hands trembling, and raised it high. A cheer rose, ragged but fierce, filling the night air. For the first time since the battles began, she felt something lift inside her. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of hope. The town wasn't just surviving anymore. It was becoming something greater. A place that could stand, endure, and maybe even thrive again. She planted the flag in the earth, the symbol of their defiance fluttering in the wind, and vowed silently that as long as she held her father's rifle, as long as she drew breath, no enemy would ever break them again. The banner she had planted in the square became more than cloth. It became a promise. Each morning, the townsfolk passed it on their way to work, and each evening, it stood against the fading light like a silent sentinel. She often found herself staring at it during the quiet hours, the fabric rippling in the wind, reminding her that survival was no longer enough. They had to build something stronger than fear. And so she pushed them harder, driving every lesson deeper, every routine sharper, every pair of hands busier than before. Where once there had been scattered survivors, now there was the beginning of a militia, and where there had been despair, now there was discipline. Yet with every brick laid and every trench dug, she felt the unspoken truth. The enemy was still out there, licking their wounds, watching, waiting. Her scouts brought back reports of movements to the east, rumors of scattered raider bands gathering under new leaders. The fractured war machine was reassembling itself, and it was only a matter of time before they returned with greater numbers. She didn't share every detail with the people. They needed resolve, not dread. But in the council meetings with her uncle and the elders, she made it clear. "They will return," she said firmly, eyes hard. "And when they do, they'll come not for plunder but for revenge. Last time they underestimated us. Next time they won't." Her uncle leaned forward, hands clasped tight. "Then we need allies." The word hung heavy in the room. Allies meant leaving the safety of their walls, venturing into the wider wasteland where trust was rarer than clean water. Still, she knew he was right. Alone they could endure for a time. Together with others they might stand forever. The decision was made. She would lead a small party beyond their borders, seeking out other settlements, testing the waters of alliance. The thought twisted her stomach. She had grown so used to defending, to being the anchor, that leaving felt like tearing herself away from the very thing she fought for. But the banner in the square reminded her, this was bigger than her. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, "A rifle defends a home, but unity builds a future." She carried the M24 across her back as she set out with 5 others, the wasteland stretching before them like an endless sea of dust and ruin. The journey was brutal. Days of heat that blistered their skin, nights of cold that bit into their bones. They walked past the bones of old cities, skeletons of towers rising against the horizon, their hollow windows staring like empty eyes. Sometimes they found traces of life, tracks in the dirt, smoke curling faintly in the distance, but more often they found only silence. At night, as the others slept in shifts, she sat with her rifle cradled in her arms, scanning the darkness for movement. The world beyond their walls was vast and unforgiving, and she realized just how fragile their little town was in the face of it. But fragility was not defeat. Fragility could become strength if it learned how to harden. On the 5th day, they stumbled upon a small encampment tucked into the ruins of a gas station. Men and women eyed them warily, weapons raised, but when she lowered her rifle and spoke of their battle, of how they had held against overwhelming odds, something in the strangers shifted. They were tired, hungry, desperate for hope. She didn't offer promises she couldn't keep, but she spoke with the fire that had carried her through every storm. "Stand with us," she said. "Fight beside us, and together we'll carve a place no raider can take." A handful agreed, their leader clasping her hand with a grip like iron. It wasn't much, 24 fighters at most, but it was a beginning. They returned weeks later, weary but not empty-handed. The townsfolk welcomed the newcomers with cautious optimism, offering food, water, and shelter. For the first time, the schoolhouse was too small to hold all their meetings. She stood at the front of the crowd, the M24 resting against her shoulder, and declared, "This is how we win. Not by surviving alone, but by standing together." Cheers rose, ragged but strong, echoing against the broken walls of their town. The banner in the square fluttered higher, its edges fraying but its meaning growing stronger. But peace was fragile. Within days, smoke was spotted on the horizon. Scouts reported raider movements again, larger this time, more organized. The news rippled through the settlement like a cold wind, chilling even the bravest hearts. She called the council together, the newcomer standing alongside her uncle and the elders. "They're testing us," she said, her voice calm despite the dread curling in her gut. "This will not be like before. This will be war." Her words carried no illusions, only the blunt edge of truth. The room was silent, every face turned to her, waiting for direction. And in that silence she realized something that stole her breath. They weren't waiting for the council anymore. They were waiting for her. The mantle of leadership had shifted fully, quietly, inevitably. She was no longer just the daughter with her father's rifle. She was the commander of their future. The weight of it pressed hard against her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she squared her shoulders and said, "Then we make them regret ever stepping onto our soil. We'll use every trap, every wall, every bullet. We'll fight until there's nothing left to take." Her uncle's eyes shone with pride, the others nodding in grim agreement. Plans were drawn, defenses reinforced, every able body drilled until exhaustion became second nature. The town was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming a fortress. As the days bled toward confrontation, she spent her nights on the rooftop, the M24 across her lap, staring into the dark. She thought of her father often, of how he might have smiled to see her now, leading not just with her rifle but with her will. She thought of the dead, of the 23 buried in shallow graves, of how their sacrifice demanded she never falter. And she thought of the children who still laughed, even if softly, even if cautiously, and knew that everything she did was for them. She had become more than a guardian. She had become the line between annihilation and survival. And she would hold that line no matter the cost. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she cleaned her rifle in silence, each motion deliberate, ritualistic. The sound of footsteps drew her attention, and she looked up to find her uncle watching her. He studied her for a long moment before saying softly, "You've become more than your father ever dreamed. And I think wherever he is, he knows." Her throat tightened, but she didn't reply. She simply nodded, slid around into the chamber and whispered to herself, "Then let him watch me finish this." The night before the final assault, the town was wrapped in a silence so heavy it felt alive, pressing into every corner, every heart. The watchfires along the barricades flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the worn faces of those who stood guard. She walked the perimeter slowly, the M24 slung across her chest, boots crunching against gravel, her eyes meeting those of her people one by one. They looked at her not with doubt, but with a strange, fierce calm, as if her presence alone steadied them against the storm they knew was coming. She gave no rousing speeches, no empty promises. She simply looked each of them in the eyes and nodded, letting them see that she was as unyielding as the walls they stood behind. At dawn the raiders came. The ground shook with the thunder of their engines, armored trucks rolling like beasts across the plain, banners of skulls and rust flapping in the wind. Dust rose behind them in a choking wave, blotting out the horizon until it seemed as if the world itself was collapsing into their fury. The townsfolk tightened their grips on rifles, bows, even sharpened farm tools, standing shoulder to shoulder along the barricades. Children were hidden deep in the basements, their mothers whispering promises of safety that they weren't sure they could keep. She climbed to her rooftop, the M24 cradled in her hands, the scope already finding its mark. Her breath slowed, her heart steady, the familiar rhythm of war returning to her blood. She whispered a prayer, not for herself but for the 100 souls who stood with her. The first shot rang out like a drumbeat of destiny. Through the scope, she watched the raider commander tumble from his truck, his body crumpling into the dust. Chaos rippled instantly through their ranks, but still they surged forward, weapons blazing, engines roaring. She worked the bolt of the M24 with calm precision, each shot a sentence, each bullet carving space between survival and slaughter. Below her, the townsfolk answered with fire of their own, arrows arcing, rifles cracking, the barricades alive with defiance. The raiders crashed into the outer defenses, metal grinding against stone, men howling as they leapt from trucks to scale the walls. But the town had been hardened, prepared. Boiling oil spilled, hidden traps snapped, and for every raider who climbed, 3 fell screaming back into the dirt. She shifted her scope, her vision narrowing to a single raider who had broken through the first line, machete raised high as he charged toward the heart of the settlement. Her breath caught, the same scarred leader she had killed weeks ago, or his brother, a mirror of his rage, eyes burning with vengeance. She fired. The round struck true, the man spinning to the ground, but the sight jolted her, reminding her that this war was generational, endless, feeding on blood and revenge. She couldn't stop it forever. But she could stop it here. The battle raged for hours, the air thick with smoke, gunfire, and screams. Her arm burned from recoil, her eyes stung with sweat and dust, but still she did not falter. Every time her people wavered, her voice cut through the chaos, shouting orders, rallying their spirits. "Hold the line," she roared, her voice raw but unbreakable. They obeyed not because she demanded it but because they believed. The banner in the square snapped in the wind, visible even through the haze, its simple symbol of rifle and wheat burning like a beacon. As the sun reached its zenith, the raider assault began to falter. Trucks burned, bodies littered the plain, and the survivors hesitated, their fury finally cracking beneath the weight of resistance. She seized the moment, raising her rifle above her head and shouting, "Drive them back! This is our home." Her people surged forward, pouring out from behind the barricades in a tide of defiance, pushing the raiders into retreat. What had begun as defense became pursuit, every shot and strike fueled by the memory of the lives already lost. By dusk it was over. The raiders fled into the wasteland, broken and scattered, leaving their dead and dying behind. The town stood bloodied but unbroken, the barricades scarred, the streets littered with the debris of war. She descended from the rooftop at last, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her rifle heavy in her hands. The survivors gathered in the square, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, their eyes locked on her. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, slowly, her uncle stepped forward, his voice rough with pride. "Because of you we still stand." She looked around at the faces, each one marked by suffering yet glowing with life. Her throat tightened as she lowered the M24, resting its butt against the ground. "Because of us," she corrected softly. "Every one of us." The crowd murmured in agreement, some weeping, others smiling through the tears. The children were brought up from the basements, their laughter thin but real, cutting through the grief like sunlight through storm clouds. She watched them run across the square, their small hands brushing the edges of the banner, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt a deep, steady peace settle in her chest. That night, as the fires of victory burned low, she climbed once more to her rooftop. The M24 lay across her knees, the barrel scarred, the stock worn smooth by her grip. She gazed out across the wasteland, the stars sharp above, the air carrying the faint scent of smoke and blood. She thought of her father again, of the lessons he had etched into her bones, of the rifle he had left her. It was no longer just a weapon. It was a legacy, a thread connecting the past to the future, binding her to the souls she had sworn to protect. She whispered into the night, "We did it, Dad. We saved them." Her uncle joined her quietly, sitting beside her without a word. They watched the horizon together, the silence between them not empty but full. After a long time he spoke, his voice steady. "What now?" She turned her gaze to the square below, where her people slept under the banner, where laughter and hope had begun to return. She tightened her grip on the rifle and answered simply, "Now we build. And we keep building. So they never fear again." The wind stirred, lifting the banner in the square, its fabric glowing in the moonlight. She knew the raiders would return one day, that new enemies would rise, that peace was always fragile in a broken world. But she also knew that as long as she held her father's rifle, as long as her people stood together, no force could ever truly break them. She had inherited a weapon, but she had built a family. And for that family, for those 100 souls who now looked to her as more than a leader, more than a protector, but as their heart, she would fight until the very end. The end.